Welcome boys and girls, Costin here with my Empire unit tier list for Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires campaigns. When discussing the Empire, it is an interesting situation because unlike a lot of different races in the game, an Empire army is not about which unit is good and which unit is bad. It's more about the synergy of an army composition. So, for instance, you can have a unit that's not necessarily very good, but because it synergizes well with the army you're leading, it's actually a very worthwhile unit to use. So that's kind of what I'm going to try and work based on. And we start with the Empire Swordsman, an F tier unit if I've ever seen one. Honestly, they're the single worst units that you could possibly recruit in a campaign. First off, you can't just recruit them from a settlement, and maybe if you could recruit them from a settlement, they would be more useful. Secondly, their actual stats are abysmal, and thirdly, when we're thinking about an Empire army, what do you want as the Empire with your infantry? Your infantry is not necessarily going to win engagements against most enemy forces. They're certainly not going to win against Greenskins or Chaos or Sanesh or anything like that. Instead, you want them to be line holders. Well, Empire Swordsmen are not great line holders. They're not good at doing damage, and yeah, you can argue they're cheap, but to be quite frank about it, they're just really not worth recruiting in any situation in a Warhammer 3 campaign. For those of you that play multiplayer, I would be curious to hear your opinions on this, but I think even from a multiplayer standpoint, there's better units to go for. That brings me to Spearmen, Empire Spearmen. You can recruit them from any settlement, so they are widely available, and since you may have different priorities in terms of the building slots you're using, you may want to just grab a handful of spearmen if you lack anything else in terms of infantry. But they're not really that good either. So from a lot of perspectives of infantry, this is the main weakness of the Empire. I mean, there are races that are range-based. You look at High Elves, you look at Cathay, for instance. But they have fairly solid infantry. In fact, if we look at Wood Elves have pretty damn good infantry. It's just they're overshadowed, of course, by, Treecan and their range units. But it's not like their infantry is terrible. It's more of a situation that you just kind of want to recruit other units. Whereas with the Empire, very rarely do I see a situation where I want to recruit spearmen. Especially because we have spearmen with shields, and this is where we have a different discussion. Spearmen with shields do require a barracks, but as a unit, I will argue quite firmly that when you're building an Empire army, you do have several choices. You can go with outriders, pistoliers early on, or you can go crossbowmen, handgunners, etc. From my perspective, there's almost always going to be an argument in favor of spearmen with shields. As line holders, they're pretty effective, even though their armor is weak. They're not going to stop an enemy, but they will hold a line decently well until your range units and your cav can get the job done. And that's the reason I would consider spearmen with shields kind of an A-tier unit. You almost always want to recruit them during the course of a campaign, and oddly enough, because they have shields, and this is one of the main advantages, like, obviously their anti-large benefit gives them that flank protection that you want as an Empire. Like, usually I try and protect my flanks with spearmen shields, put my lords and heroes in the middle, absorb damage, and use my range units to finish the job, or combination of range units or range cav to do the job. And this is the role of spearmen with shields. We could talk about electric count state troopers, but given the limitations on recruitment, by the way, I'm not going to include them in this tier list, just worth pointing out. I mean, generally speaking, pretty much all of them are worth recruiting to a degree or another if you can get your hands on them. Then we have Greatswords. So from a combat perspective, I'm gonna put Greatswords as a B tier unit. I like, whereas with Spearman Shields, you have a reason to recruit them. The reason being they provide that flank protection. Well, if Greatswords are meant to replace Spearmen with Shields, obviously they're better units, but when you think about the kind of units so many races, so many infantry-based races have, or so many races with a variety of units have, Greatswords are just not really that great as a unit in general. I mean, they are okay-ish, and that's kind of why I'm putting them in B tier. Like A tier and S tier are just phenomenal units, and I just think Greatswords are mediocre. Like, if they were tier 2, that would probably be a very different discussion if they were tier 2, but as it stands, like, you look at Sargard, hell, you even look at Armor Cossars, you could even consider White Lions or Dwarf Warriors and, Longbeards and all that, and I just think, like, Greatswords are not a match for what other races of Order do bring to the table. I mean, they will do the job, but of holding the line, but they're not going to be damage dealers. They're not going to win engagements on their own during the course of a campaign. Skirmish is a different discussion, right? When you think about trading for value and all that. But when you're playing a campaign, you think about, okay, I want a couple of infantry units to protect my flanks, to maybe win against enemy infantry units, all that, and I just don't think Greatswords are quite as good as they should be. Then we have Flagellants. I'll be quite blunt. I think Flagellants are an F tier unit. Yes, you might think, oh, but they're the equivalent of Slayers for the Empire. No. Slayers have a lot of weaknesses, don't get me wrong on that, but the stat situation as well as various skills you can get, with Demon Slayers, controlling an army, actually can make Slayers useful in a campaign. Though, most of the time, I just don't think they're worth using either. But Flagellants, the only reason you would probably want to use them ever, and even then that's a discussion, is if you're playing a Volkmar campaign and you just want to recruit a cheap-ass infantry to maybe deal with Manfred. Not that they're going to do an exceptional job in that respect either. So yeah, Flagellants, not really worth recruiting. Then we have halberdiers. A lot of people surprisingly like halberdiers, and I'm going to have to move this a bit. A lot of people seem to like halberdiers. I'm just going to, do that. But from my view, you rarely, if ever, want to recruit them in a campaign. You might say they're more effective than spearmen with shields. Yes, that is undeniably true, but here's the trade-off. They're terrible in auto-resolve, especially when you're building a hybrid army, and as the Empire, you're almost always going to want to build a hybrid army, and going full-on melee as the Empire is a very questionable strategy. So, having a unit that takes as much damage as these guys do, because they will take more damage. Like, most of the time when I'm fighting engagements, even when I'm fighting them, let alone the out-resolve situation, I just find Spearmen of Shields to be more effective at their principal role, which is not winning the infantry engagement, because they won't. When you're thinking, Graveguard, Biggins, all that kind of stuff, if you think of units that you're going to be dealing with, Warriors of Chaos, if you're fighting against Festus, etc., most of the time halberdiers are going to be only situationally useful. That's where I stand on them. They would be higher. I could see an argument for them being higher if they weren't so damn terrible in terms of their auto-resolve result. Then we have Empire Archers. I'm going to put them in C tier. They're not in C tier because they're terrible. They're just not especially great. Like, the Empire gets a lot of unit variety early on. Before the rework in Thrones of Decay, they would have been ranked higher, but nowadays, you kind of just don't have a reason to really recruit them. Like, you can get to tier 2 very quickly, you can get a lot of different units very quickly, and even tier 1 when you're talking about unit variety. Their use situation, like the only campaign you even really bother to recruit them is Marcus Wolfhard, and even then, not really all that much, just, very, very, very early on in that campaign, and you move past them very quickly. Then we have Free Company Militia, a hybrid melee pistol unit that's not really great. Again, we could consider Slayers, though these guys obviously don't compare to Slayers. Slayer Pirates. Slayer Pirates, or, Sartosa Militia and all that, they provide actual use given the units you can recruit in those campaigns. Like, Slayer Pirates are pretty solid units you can recruit early on in a campaign, whereas Free Company Militia, I just do not see a reason to ever recruit them in a campaign. It's kind of weird how many people I see actually using them. Then we have Crossbowmen. So, Crossbowmen, I think I'm going to put Crossbowmen in B tier. I mean, they're a decently effective ranged unit. You could even argue they should deserve a higher spot on this list because of how useful they can be, their damage potential and all that. And they're the reason archers and, other units are lower on this list, because, hey, you get crossbows. They get the job done, right? I mean, just look at Cathay. Of course, the difference is that the Empire has different options than Cathay at the same tier. So that's kind of the thing that prevents crossbowmen. They're not a bad unit, far from it. They're cheap, they're effective, but yeah, you have so many different options, which we'll get into when we talk about Gunpowder unit. Huntsmen. Yeah, I'm also going to put Huntsmen in a B tier. They do better than Crossbowmen, though they're a tier higher, but when you think about what other units are at the same tier, you think to yourself, okay, I can get Null Ironsides, or I can get Huntsmen. I think, generally speaking, a lot of people would agree with the sentiment that Null Ironsides are just the much better unit, and kind of the unit you want to recruit. Even with all the issues Gunpowder units do have in a campaign, in battle situations. Handgunners. Yeah, so handgunners are, again, just like Crossbowmen, an effective unit for their tier. They get the job done quite well for an infantry-based Gunpowder unit, but just not exceptional. I just don't think they deserve anything higher than a B tier. Like, that's the thing with Greatswords, Crossbowmen, Handgunners, and Huntsmen. They're not terrible units, they're just not exceptional to use. Then we have, let's go with it in order, Empire Knights. So, Empire Knights, like, when you think about how much variety of cavalry the Empire has, is there really a reason to recruit Empire Knights in a campaign? Not really. They're not, I'll even be more decent on this. I think they're a C tier unit. I mean, if you get a couple of them through Confederation, you don't necessarily want to throw them away, but when you're talking about actual unit recruitment, there's, again, better options for you to go for. Reichsguard. Yeah, Reichsguard, definitely an A tier unit. Very good cavalry for its tier, especially. That's one of the main benefits of the Empire. See, Bretonia, one can argue, has better cavalry than the Empire, though that's a really big discussion from my perspective. But here's the biggest advantage the Empire has. Cavalry availability. And also variety of cavalry. Like, there's different roles for cavalry. Reichsguard are kind of the middle of the road cavalry that you can recruit in Empire. Not the best in the stand-up melee fight, not the best shock cavalry, but just really solid middle of the road unit, and doing exceptionally well if you're playing as Karl Franz. Knights of the Black Rose. So this is a cavalry unit with Knights of the Black Rose. I'm going to put them in B tier. They're stand-up melee cavalry, so they're not shock cavalry. They will go into a fight and hold their own. They're not going to be cavalry you're going to get the most effectiveness out of from cycle charging. I think that's the reason I would not necessarily rank them higher than B tier. Just that specific role of having a unit that stands its ground and fights, well, they're not more effective than infantry in that perspective, even with all the issues the Empire has with regards to infantry. And with cavalry, I would argue quite firmly that shock cavalry is generally more useful. Unless, when you're talking about questing knights and when you're talking about Grail Guardians, that's a different discussion with those units. Like, yeah, I would argue questing knights are a better unit, and Grail Guardians are definitely a better unit than Knights of the Black Rose. Not a terrible unit. Again, just not something deserving higher than B tier. Knights of the Blazing Sun. This is a cavalry unit that's pretty effective against undead. Before, they were annoying to actually recruit. Tier requirements, the situation with Talabium, etc. But nowadays, I quite like using them. Their charge potential, their flaming attacks, just makes them pretty useful as a unit to get. In fact, more often than not, I prefer getting Knights of the Blazing Sun as opposed to Reiksguard, though, again, there's nothing wrong with Reiksguard, and especially if you're playing as Karl Franz, you do want to get them. Demigryphs. Next up, we have Demigryphs. We have two versions of Demigryphs. So, with Demigryphs, we have halberds and we have lancers. One is better in a pure melee fight, another is better in a shock cavalry role, but both of them are pretty good units. And, if you're playing an Empire campaign, you want to get both of them, really. Or, at least the lance version. Like, that's one of the things that the Empire does benefit from monstrous cavalry units, and that's what Demigryphs are in a campaign. That's the role they provide. Then we move on to, though, whether or not you want to consider both of them at the same tier, that's, again, its own discussion. Yeah, the Empire does tend to have some pretty good cavalry units, and I do believe that these 4 units are definitely A tier units, not quite S tier. Then we have Pistoliers. So Pistoliers are your skirmish cav unit. Obviously, they don't do well in melee, but you can recruit them very early in a campaign. However, outside of that situation, do you really want to recruit Pistoliers? And my answer to that would be no. Not a bad unit, not a terrible unit. It's certainly a unit you recruit early on in a campaign, but only really early on in a campaign perspective. I'm just considering whether or not I should keep the list as it is or change certain things. Then we have Outriders. So Outriders, I will strongly argue in favor of them being an S tier unit. Here's the reasons. While in sieges, their value proposition is going to be a big question, the main benefit these guys bring you, they are longer range, they can really be effective at harassing enemy units, and from my perspective, you want a unit like this in your army, a long-ranged, fast-moving cav unit that can, or relatively fast, they're not the fastest units in the world, but you want this because if you're fighting vampire counts, for instance, or greenskins, you're going to fight outnumbered. And so you can use Outriders to distract a good portion of the enemy army. You can also use them to draw the enemy army into position. Like if you're attacking an enemy force, then the value of Outriders is that you can send them forward, do some damage, and the enemy army will start coming towards you. Grenade launcher Outriders, I think they're not as useful as regular Outriders most of the time, but they can do a fair amount of damage with their grenade launchers, from my perspective. Like, when you're fighting outnumbered and you're dealing with masses of undead or greenskins, or you know, Beastmen, Norska, whatever, these guys, their AoE damage is not something to be ignored. Obviously, they can't attack flying units. That's their downside. And they're not going to be as good at... They're not going to do well in terms of attracting the enemy army to attack your positions. But one can't ignore the damage potential these guys have. I wouldn't go too hard on Outriders, Pistoliers, or Outriders with grenade launchers, but that is kind of my perspective on the subject. Next up, we have Nuln Ironsides, which, yeah, they're an S tier unit. No discussion about it. Your principal ranged combat unit that basically eclipses every other ranged unit you have, or ranged infantry unit you have, as the Empire. They're the reason crossbowmen, handgunners, and huntsmen are in B tier, because when you get them, and you can get them relatively quick, like especially as Karl Franz, given the population surplus you can acquire there. And don't get me started on how ridiculous Elspeth's gunpowder units can get in general, or Gelt's population surplus in his campaign if he returns to Empire. But yeah, Nuln Ironsides are a great unit, and they're really the core of your army, with the exception of cavalry. Like, I would say the cavalry is really going to be so, but you do have to consider the siege situation. And you might ask, well, okay, but how are gunpowder units going to be effective in sieges? Well, that's because the Empire has great ways of breaking down walls, and through those wall gaps, you can use these guys to shoot, and that's the reason they're effective. And then Hockland long rifles, you won't want too many of them in an army, but a couple of snipers to focus on specific entities in an army, pretty damn useful from my perspective. Then we have war wagons, and war wagons with mortars. So regular war wagons, I will argue that they're a D tier unit. Here's the thing about chariot units. When you think about the sleds that Kislev has, the main value of sleds for Kislev, or any kind of chariot unit, is not their range combat capability or their skirmishing capability. It's their ability to get stuck in melee and also win those fights. That's what war sleds, light war sleds, and heavy war sleds provide for Kislev. That's not what war wagons do for the Empire, and that's the reason they're not so useful. Mortar war wagons, bit more useful, but mortars are just not a great artillery unit for the Empire, so I just don't really see much value in recruiting war wagons, or very, very rarely. Speaking about mortars, regular mortars, also a D tier unit. You only recruit them just if you want an early game artillery piece, but that's basically it. They're not great. They're not great in sieges because they will do terrible against towers. They'll do terrible against walls, and trying to do damage to an enemy army who can dodge their shots, if you look at higher battle difficulties. Like, on lower battle difficulties, they might be more effective, I suppose, but on higher battle difficulties, they're just not great. And Vampire Coast is a different discussion, because their mortars are a very different beast altogether, but for the Empire, yeah, I think mortars are just a D tier unit that you only recruit very early on in a campaign, and then forget about them. We then have cannons. So cannons, A tier unit. It's a unit you almost always want to recruit in a campaign, siege situation, especially not so much in battles, but you know, when you're dealing with sieges, and you will be dealing with sieges, you want your cannons. 2 free units per army. Just something that is important and something that is needed. Hellblaster volley guns, I would say, like, also kind of not a D tier unit. I would say like a C tier unit. Between the tier requirements and their limited usage in battle, they're only useful in a handful of situations, and even then, you will benefit from getting other units much more. That's where I stand on Hellblaster volley guns, at least artillery units. We'll talk about the steam tank in just a second. Hellstorm rocket batteries, Yeah, definitely an S tier unit. Just the sheer amount of damage these guys can do makes them incredibly effective and useful to get in a campaign. Like, just rocket barrages are powerful. Who knew? And it's kind of funny when you think about the real life equivalent, because these kind of rockets were pretty useless in real life. Not so much in Warhammer 3 or Warhammer in general. Then we have Luminarchs. I'm going to put them in B tier. They are capable of doing a significant amount of damage to big single entities in particular. But between tier requirements and the fact that they're kind of useless against anything else, like, yeah, you can try and hit a lord on the ground with them. You might even hit it. That's kind of the problem. Like, when they do damage, it's phenomenal. But you might not do any kind of damage with them. And so maybe getting 1 or 2 of them per army very later on in a campaign can be useful, but there's just better units to acquire from my perspective. Landships. B tier, a discount siege tank. And that's kind of thing, or steam tanks, sorry. Landships are not a phenomenal unit. They're faster, though they're also taller, so they're a bigger target, more vulnerable. There's pros and cons, but most of the time, just, yeah, landships are not necessarily a phenomenal unit to recruit, and realistically, you're just better off going with steam tanks in your army. Though not strictly speaking regular steam tanks. That's the thing. Like, regular steam tanks, they're a pretty solid unit for the Empire, especially against late game armies. But given that you have Hellblaster volley gun steam tanks, I would dare say that most of the time you're just going to be far better off getting them. So I'm going to put them in D tier, and I'll argue Hellblaster steam tanks are just the better version of the unit you have. Like, the damage effectiveness of these guys is going to be superior. So between the two units, like, the only steam tank I generally recruit is obviously the Electric Count variant, but outside of that, I just don't think regular steam tanks are worth it in a campaign. And that is my tier list for the Empire. Costin signing out. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you next time.